You won't believe what our power-hungry HOA president demanded this time. Margaret Whitmore, our overbearing HOA dictator, had already imposed some ridiculous rules in Oak Ridge Estates, but this one took things to a whole new level. She forced every homeowner to comply with strict new regulations on lawn ornaments and fence heights, threatening steep fines for those who refused. I stared at the bright red notice in disbelief, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Mandatory. All lawn ornaments exceeding 18 inches and fences over 4 feet must be removed immediately. Noncompliance will result in a $200 daily fine. My hands trembled with anger as I marched inside, tossing the notice onto the kitchen counter. 5 years living in Oak Ridge Estates, and the HOA had pulled some absurd stunts, but this was beyond unreasonable. My phone rang. It was Rachel Carter from across the street. "Did you see this?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "Just now," I muttered. "This can't be legal." "John is furious," she said, sighing. "He built that wooden trellis himself, and now she wants it gone." Margaret Whitmore had finally lost her mind. Our HOA president, with her sleek bob and permanent scowl, was infamous for micromanaging the neighborhood. This was the same woman who fined the Parkers for leaving their garbage cans out an hour too long, and who had hounded the Mitchells with warning letters over a garden gnome she deemed unsightly. I peered through my blinds. Already, neighbors stood in their yards, waving red notices and arguing. My stomach knotted when I spotted Margaret herself, clipboard in hand, going house to house with a smug smile. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised to find her standing there, tapping her designer heel impatiently. "Good afternoon," she said, her practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Just making sure you received today's notice about the new landscaping guidelines." "Oh, I got it," I replied, crossing my arms. "And I have serious concerns about property rights." Her smile tightened. The board voted unanimously. We discovered multiple violations affecting neighborhood aesthetics. This measure ensures uniformity. So we all suffer because a few people broke some arbitrary rules. I challenged. "Rules exist for a reason," she snapped. "Remove non-compliant items by the end of the week, or face fines." She spun on her heel and marched to the next house. I pulled out my phone and called my brother-in-law, David Reynolds, the chief of police. After explaining the situation, he whistled low. "That's a lawsuit waiting to happen," he said. "HOAs have power, but they can't enforce rules that weren't properly voted on. Can they really force us to do this?" I asked. "Send me that notice," he replied. "I'll look into it." That evening, I watched as neighbors reluctantly dismantled trellises, dug up bird baths, and carried statues inside. Some people tried covering their fences in neutral paint to avoid the fines. Others took photos of their yards, determined to fight back. Just before sunset, John Hayes knocked on my door, thick legal documents in hand. "I've been reviewing our HOA bylaws," he said, his gray eyebrows furrowed. This rule wasn't properly enacted. They needed a 2/3 community vote for an aesthetic policy change. So it's unenforceable. I asked hopefully. "In theory," he admitted. "But Margaret isn't going to back down without a fight." I slept poorly that night, my mind racing with anger and frustration. By morning, my street was a war zone. Neighbors argued on sidewalks, and some defiantly left their fences standing. I watched from my window as Margaret and Greg Sanders, a nervous compliance committee member, made their rounds, clipboard in hand. When they reached my property, Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. "You're in violation," she said smoothly. "And I'm challenging this," I shot back. "You didn't follow protocol." Greg shifted uncomfortably. Margaret ignored him. "Submit an appeal if you wish," she said. "But fines start today." By midday, I had sent the bylaws and the notice to David. An hour later, he called back. "You were right," he said. "This wasn't legally approved. The city council has oversight over zoning regulations, and this oversteps HOA authority." A slow smile spread across my face. "So what now?" "Now," he said, "we make this official." That evening, I gathered with John, Rachel, and a handful of neighbors at my house. "We're fighting this," I declared. "We're taking it to the city." By the next morning, our petition had over 50 signatures. A week later, Margaret stormed into a city council meeting, only to be met with overwhelming opposition. As David presented the case, she realized she had lost control. Margaret's smug confidence faltered for the first time. Without proper approval, the council chair declared, "These fines are null and void. This policy is invalid." A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret turned red. "You can't do this," she hissed. John stood. "Actually, we can. The law says so." 2 weeks later, the HOA was forced to rescind the policy, and Margaret Whitmore's iron grip on Oak Ridge Estates finally cracked. But as we all knew, she wouldn't go down without a fight, and this was only the beginning. "Violation," she announced, making a dramatic show of writing on her clipboard. "I'm exercising my right to security," I replied firmly. The HOA bylaws require community approval for security-related policy changes. Margaret Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "We had an emergency board meeting. The decision is final. Then I'll need to see the meeting minutes and voting record." Her face flushed red. "Those will be available at next month's meeting. Meanwhile, your fines begin today." As she walked away, I noticed a white van crawling slowly down our street, the driver clearly scanning properties. Chills ran down my spine. By the afternoon, social media was buzzing with complaints from our neighborhood. Someone had created a group called Take Back Oak Ridge that gained 50 members within hours. My post about the suspicious van was shared dozens of times. That night, I invited John Hayes, Rachel Carter, and several other concerned neighbors to my living room. We formed a committee and planned our resistance. "We need to understand why this is happening now," said Rachel, a paralegal with sharp instincts. "Margaret has been HOA president for years. What's changed?" John shuffled through the HOA financial statements I had requested months ago. "Look at these landscaping expenses. They've tripled in the past year." I squinted at the paperwork. "Whitmore Enterprises? Is that Daniel Whitmore's company?" John nodded. Something doesn't add up. The doorbell rang, interrupting us. I opened it to find Greg Sanders, Margaret's committee member, looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "But you need to know, this isn't about property aesthetics. Margaret's brother-in-law works for a security company. They're using this to force homeowners into buying a new security system they'll propose next month." My jaw dropped. "That's illegal." Greg swallowed hard. "I've already said too much." He hurried away into the darkness. The next morning, I found my first fine notice taped to my mailbox, $200. But I wasn't alone. 6 other houses on my street had refused to comply too. I called David Reynolds, my brother-in-law, the chief of police. "Things are escalating," I said. "Margaret is using the HOA for personal gain." "Interesting," David replied thoughtfully. "I may need to pay your neighborhood an official visit." As we spoke, I heard shouting outside. Rushing to the window, I saw Margaret confronting Mr. Mitchell, who was trying to remove a lawn ornament after noticing someone suspicious near his property. "Rules are rules," she snapped, stepping between him and the fixture. "This is my property." Mr. Mitchell protested. "Not my problem." I grabbed my phone and recorded the confrontation, my hands shaking with anger. This had gone too far. That afternoon, it happened, exactly what we had feared. The Parkers, who had reluctantly complied with the fence height regulations, returned from grocery shopping to find their backyard shed emptied of valuable tools and bikes. The police arrived, taking statements, shaking their heads at the circumstances. As neighbors gathered around the crime scene, Margaret appeared, her face tight with denial. "This has nothing to do with the new policy," she insisted. "Theft happens everywhere. Not when people can properly secure their homes," I countered as others murmured in agreement. Margaret pointed a manicured finger at me. "Your fine has doubled for inciting unrest." That's when I knew this wasn't just about enforcing ridiculous regulations. Something corrupt was happening in our HOA, and Margaret Whitmore was at the center of it. My phone buzzed with a message from David. "Found something interesting about Whitmore Enterprises. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. I smiled grimly as Margaret walked away, unaware of what was coming. The theft at the Parker house ignited a firestorm. By morning, 3 more homes reported missing items, all from yards forced to comply with the new restrictions. David arrived at my house wearing his full police uniform, his gold badge gleaming in the sunlight. "Ready for this?" he asked, reviewing his notes. "This might go deeper than we thought." I nodded. "Let's take her down." Notes one last time. My heart pounded as we drove the short distance to the HOA office, a small renovated house at the entrance to our community. Through the window, I could see Margaret sitting at her desk, looking important as she shuffled papers. The receptionist's eyes widened at the sight of David's uniform. "Can I help you?" she asked hesitantly. "Chief Reynolds to see Margaret Whitmore," David stated professionally. "Official police business." We were ushered in immediately. Margaret's smug expression faltered when she saw me enter behind David. "Mrs. Whitmore," David began, "I'm investigating a series of thefts in Oak Ridge Estates directly linked to your new lawn ornament and fence height regulations." Margaret straightened her blazer. "Our policies are internal matters, Chief Reynolds. The HOA isn't responsible for criminal activity." "Actually," David countered, "creating conditions that invite criminal activity makes you potentially liable. 3 break-ins within 24 hours of your policy enforcement isn't a coincidence." Her face paled slightly. "We had valid reasons, such as illegal property modifications?" I interjected. "Exactly," she snapped. "Then why not target those specific violations?" David asked reasonably. "Instead of endangering the entire community?" Margaret's assistant, a nervous young woman named Megan, slipped into the room with a stack of files. "The board meeting minutes you requested," she whispered, placing them on Margaret's desk. I caught sight of the top document. Financial records showing payments to Whitmore Enterprises, $45,000 for specialized landscaping, another $27,000 for entrance maintenance. My eyes widened as I noticed another company name, Secure Tech Solutions, with the same mailing address as Whitmore Enterprises. "Interesting reading material," I commented, nodding toward the papers. Margaret quickly covered them with a folder. "We're done here. I'll have our attorney contact you." Speaking of attorneys, David continued smoothly. "I've consulted with the district attorney about potential misappropriation of HOA funds, particularly when board members direct contracts to family businesses without competitive bidding." The color drained from Margaret's face. "That's absurd. Everything was approved by the board. The same board that approved the new regulation without a proper community vote." I asked. "The board where your sister and brother-in-law hold seats." Margaret stood abruptly. "I want you both out of my office. Now." "Certainly," David replied calmly. But first, he placed an official document on her desk. "This is a formal request to immediately suspend the new policy, pending investigation into its connection to recent criminal activity." As Margaret sputtered, Megan accidentally knocked over a stack of files. Papers scattered across the floor, revealing colorful brochures for security systems from Secure Tech Solutions. "Implementing next month, are they?" I asked innocently, remembering Greg's warning. Megan looked terrified as she gathered the papers, avoiding Margaret's glare. "This meeting is over," Margaret declared, her voice shaking slightly. In the parking lot, David looked thoughtful. "Those financial records could be problematic for Mrs. Whitmore. Can you get a warrant?" I asked. "Not without more evidence. But there's another approach." He pulled out his phone. "Remember Lisa Monroe from high school? She's a reporter now." My spirits lifted. The court of public opinion. That afternoon, I organized an emergency community meeting at the local library. 78 homeowners attended, more than half the neighborhood. John presented the legal case against the new regulation. The Parkers shared their break-in story. I carefully outlined the suspicious financial connections without making direct accusations. By meeting's end, we had formed an official committee to request a full audit of HOA finances and call for new board elections. Margaret didn't attend, but her few supporters looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. The next morning, I woke to pounding on my door. It was Greg, Margaret's nervous committee member, looking disheveled. "They're coming for your house," he gasped. Greg Sanders stammered. "Margaret called an emergency session last night. They've accelerated your fines and placed a lien on your property for community disruption." My stomach dropped. "Can they do that?" "Not legally," Greg said. "But they're counting on it taking months for you to fight it in court. Meanwhile, they're fast-tracking the security system contract before they lose control." I thanked Greg and immediately called John and David. Within an hour, we had a plan. Lisa Monroe, David's reporter friend, arrived with a cameraman just as Margaret and 2 board members approached my house, legal papers in hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," Lisa called out, microphone extended. Channel 7 News. "We're doing a story on HOA overreach and security concerns in Oak Ridge Estates. Care to comment on the recent break-ins following your lawn ornament policy?" Margaret froze, staring at the camera in horror. "This is private HOA business. Is it also private business when HOA contracts worth over $70,000 go to companies owned by board members' families? Lisa asked innocently. Our viewers find these conflicts of interest fascinating. No comment. Margaret hissed, retreating toward her car. But the damage was done. By evening, the story ran on local news. Neighborhood safety concerns raised after HOA enforces controversial regulations. The segment included interviews with burglary victims, security experts questioning the policy's safety, and a brief mention of financial irregularities under investigation. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors I'd never even spoken to before, all expressing support and sharing their own frustrations with Margaret's ring. Around midnight, as I was finally falling asleep, headlights swept across my bedroom wall. Looking outside, I saw someone placing something in my mailbox. When they drove away, I cautiously ventured out to investigate. Inside was a USB drive and a note. Security camera footage from the boardroom meeting where the policy was really decided. Not about decorations. A friend. Heart racing, I plugged it into my computer. The footage showed Margaret, her husband Daniel, and her brother-in-law discussing the perfect opportunity to survey homes for security vulnerabilities. They laughed about how forcing strict regulations would create a need for their new security systems. Perfect marketing strategy, Daniel said on the video. Create the problem, sell the solution. I immediately sent the video to David, John, and Lisa. This was the smoking gun we needed. The next morning, Margaret's expensive sedan was parked outside my house when I stepped out to get my newspaper. She rolled down her window, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. Name your price, she said flatly. Excuse me. To end this ridiculous crusade. What do you want? No HOA fees for a year? Approval for that patio extension you wanted? Just tell me. I leaned down to look her in the eye. I want you to resign today, and I want the board to reverse every illegitimate policy you've enacted. She laughed bitterly. Never going to happen. You have no idea who you're dealing with. My husband plays golf with the mayor, and my brother-in-law is the chief of police, I reminded her. But more importantly, I have something you don't. What's that? She sneered. 78 neighbors who are done being bullied, and video evidence of your security system scheme. The blood drained from her face. What video? I smiled. The emergency board meeting needs to happen today. Noon. I've already notified everyone. As she drove away, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows and driveways. They waved and gave me thumbs-up signs. For the first time in years, our community felt united. What none of us realized was that Margaret had one more desperate move to make. One that would either destroy our resistance or completely backfire in her face. Flashing blue and red lights filled my living room as I peered through the blinds. 2 police cars had pulled up outside my house, and officers were approaching my front door. My heart leaped into my throat. This wasn't part of our plan. Police. Open up. A sharp knock rattled my door. I opened it to find 2 officers I didn't recognize. Not David's men. Are you the homeowner? One asked, his face stern. Yes. What's this about? We have a warrant to search these premises for stolen property. He handed me an official-looking document. Please step aside. Blood rushed to my face as I scanned the paper. This is ridiculous. I haven't stolen anything. Several items reported missing in recent break-ins were traced to this address. The officer stated flatly. My mind raced. Margaret. It had to be her. She was framing me. This is a setup. I protested as they began searching my home. Called Chief Reynolds. He's my brother-in-law. He'll explain everything. The officer exchanged glances with his partner. Chief Reynolds has been advised of this operation but recused himself due to a family connection. Outside, my neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, watching in confusion as the officers searched my garage, closets, and even under my bed. Rachel hurried over, her face pale with concern. What's happening? She whispered. Margaret's desperate, I replied. She's trying to discredit me before the meeting. After 30 minutes of searching, one officer emerged from my garage, holding something wrapped in a cloth. My breath caught. Is this yours? He asked, unwrapping the bundle to reveal an expensive power drill, the exact model stolen from the Parker's garage. Absolutely not, I said firmly. Someone planted that. Check it for fingerprints. Mine won't be on it. The crowd grew larger. I spotted Margaret at the edge, barely concealing her smirk. We'll need you to come down to the station to answer some questions, the officer said. My phone buzzed, a text from John. Stall them. Found something big. I'd like to call my lawyer first, I announced, loudly enough for neighbors to hear. And I'd like these officers to check my security camera footage before I go anywhere. The officer frowned. Security footage? I installed cameras after the break-ins, I explained. They record my garage and the side of my house 24/7. Margaret's smirk vanished. She hadn't counted on cameras. Inside, I pulled up the footage from last night on my laptop. The officers watched in silence as a figure in dark clothing slipped into my garage at 3:17 a.m., carrying something wrapped in cloth. Can you enhance that? One officer asked. I zoomed in as the figure turned slightly toward the camera. The streetlight caught their face for just a second, enough to recognize Daniel Whitmore. That's Daniel Whitmore, I said quietly. Margaret's husband. The officers exchanged glances again. We'll need a copy of this footage. Of course, I agreed. And I'll still come answer your questions, but first, I checked my watch. I need to attend an emergency HOA meeting at noon. Outside, John was showing neighbors something on his tablet, property records he'd pulled from the county database. The crowd grew agitated as they gathered around him. What did you find? I asked when the officers finally let me step outside. John handed me the tablet. Margaret and her family have been buying foreclosed homes in our neighborhood through shell companies, then reselling them at massive markups. And guess what triggers the foreclosures? Excessive HOA fines and liens. I stared at the records, the pattern becoming clear. They forced 6 families out in the last 2 years. A collective murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. The Mitchells pushed forward. That explains what happened to the Johnsons last year, Mrs. Mitchell said. They got fined $500 for having their trash cans out 10 minutes too long. More neighbors shared stories of seemingly minor violations that resulted in excessive penalties. The puzzle pieces were fitting together, revealing a systematic scheme targeting vulnerable homeowners. Margaret tried to slip away, but neighbors blocked her path. The meeting starts in 20 minutes, I announced. Let's all go together. The community center buzzed with excitement as nearly every household in Oak Ridge Estates gathered for what would be the most important HOA meeting in years. Oak Ridge Estates was packed into the meeting hall. Margaret Whitmore and her board members huddled at the front table, whispering in hushed, urgent tones. Just as the meeting was called to order, David Reynolds walked in, followed by Lisa Monroe and her news crew. Margaret's face twisted with fury. This is a private meeting, she barked. No media allowed. Actually, Jonathan Hayes interjected smoothly. The bylaws state all meetings must be open to observers unless a 2/3 vote says otherwise. He smiled. Shall we vote? Hands shot up across the room. Almost unanimous. The cameras would stay. Margaret gripped the table's edge, knuckles white. Fine. Let's get this over with. I stood up. Before we begin, I'd like to address the police search of my home this morning and the planted evidence found there. Gasps filled the room as I explained what had happened. Ridiculous accusations. Margaret snapped. Stick to the agenda. Let's talk about the real agenda, I said calmly, connecting my laptop to the projector. The security footage played, showing Daniel Whitmore sneaking into my garage at 3:17 a.m., carrying something wrapped in cloth. Daniel shot to his feet. That could be anyone. It's too dark to. And let's discuss these property records. I continued, clicking to the next slide. It displayed the tangled web of shell companies the Whitmores had used to buy foreclosed homes, properties seized after residents were fined into financial ruin. Margaret's face flushed deep red. You have no proof we're connected to those purchases. Actually, David Reynolds spoke from the back. The police have obtained search warrants. Bank records show direct links between Whitmore Holdings and these companies. He walked toward the front. Mrs. Whitmore, the district attorney would like to speak with you about potential fraud, harassment, and filing false police reports. The room exploded into chaos. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. This isn't over. Margaret shrieked as they escorted her and Daniel away. My attorney will. The door slammed shut, cutting off her threats. A stunned silence filled the hall. Greg Sanders, the nervous board secretary, cleared his throat. As acting board secretary, I moved to immediately rescind the lawn ornament and fence height regulations, along with all related fines. The vote was unanimous. So was the decision for a special election to replace the entire board. As we left the meeting, neighbors shook my hand, clapped my back, and thanked me for standing up. But this victory, while sweet, was just the beginning. Rebuilding Oak Ridge Estates would take more than exposing one corrupt leader. The Parkers approached, smiling for the first time in weeks. "We're having a barbecue this weekend to celebrate," Mr. Parker said. "The whole neighborhood's invited." I nodded, grateful for the sense of unity. But as I walked home, something troubled me. A for sale sign had appeared in front of Greg's house. He wasn't the only one pulling away from community involvement, burned out by the ugliness of it all. My phone buzzed. It was David. "Margaret and Daniel made bail. They'll fight this every step of the way." Do they have a chance? With their connections? Maybe. But that's tomorrow's battle, I said, looking around at my neighborhood, really looking for the first time. Behind the manicured lawns and HOA-approved fences were real people. Some had sided with Margaret out of fear. Others had remained silent, worn down by years of intimidation. How could we heal the damage? The answer came unexpectedly. As I reached my driveway, a group of kids rode by on bikes, laughing. Behind them, parents chatted and walked their dogs. Without Margaret's iron fist, life was already returning to normal. Or maybe, just maybe, a new and better normal was beginning. 6 weeks later, spring had fully arrived. Flowers bloomed in defiance of Margaret's old uniform landscaping rule. Fences of different styles and colors dotted the neighborhood. People breathed easier. As I walked toward the community center, a folder of new proposals in hand, I smiled. This wasn't just about tearing down corruption. It was about building something better. And this time, we'd do it together. Tonight marked my first meeting as the newly elected HOA treasurer. After Margaret Whitmore's arrest, I had been persuaded to run for the board, something I'd never imagined doing. Nervous? John Hayes asked, falling into step beside me. As our new HOA president, he had traded retirement leisure for community service. A little, I admitted. Presenting a budget is different from fighting corruption. "You'll do fine," he assured me. "People trust you." Inside, neighbors chatted amicably as they took their seats. No more fearful whispers or tense faces. Rachel Carter waved from her position as board secretary. "Before we begin," John announced once everyone settled, "I'd like to acknowledge that today marks exactly 1 month since the lawn ornament and fence height regulations were overturned. And I'm pleased to report that no security issues have occurred since our Community Watch program began." Applause filled the room. The Volunteer Watch program, suggested by Mr. Mitchell, had brought together people who had barely spoken before. "Now," John continued, "our treasurer has prepared the first transparent budget in Oak Ridge Estates history." I stood, distributing copies of the financial report. As you'll see, we conducted a full audit of HOA funds. The forensic accountants identified $127,000 in questionable payments over the past 3 years. Murmurs rippled through the audience. "The good news," I continued, "is that our insurance will cover most of these losses. And with proper management, we can reduce monthly dues by 15% while increasing services." The presentation went smoothly, until we reached the topic of Margaret's pending criminal case. The district attorney has filed charges for fraud, embezzlement, filing false police reports, and conspiracy, David Reynolds explained from his seat. But the Whitmores have hired an expensive defense team, arguing their actions were legal under HOA bylaws. "Can they really get away with this?" someone called out. "Not if we testify," Mr. Parker replied firmly. "I'll be the first on the stand." Others voiced their willingness to testify, but I noticed Greg Sanders shifting uncomfortably. After the meeting, he approached me in the parking lot. "I'm moving next week," he said quietly. "Margaret's been calling me, making threats about what'll happen if I testify." My heart sank. "David can protect you." "It's not just me," Greg said. "She has dirt on everyone who served on her board, things we approved without questioning. If she goes down, she's taking us with her." "That sounds like witness intimidation," I replied. "Tell David everything." Greg nodded reluctantly. "There's something else. Margaret isn't just fighting the charges. She's hired a lawyer to challenge the board election." This hit me hard. We had followed every proper procedure. On what grounds? Some technicality about notification timing. It's just a delay tactic to drain HOA resources. That was always her strategy, make fighting her more expensive than giving in. I thanked him for the warning and drove home, troubled by this new development. The community's healing might be more fragile than I'd thought. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Legal papers. Margaret was suing me personally for defamation, asking for $2 million in damages. Similar notices appeared on John's door and the Parkers. Margaret's scorched earth campaign had begun. I called an emergency meeting with the new board members. She's trying to bankrupt us individually, so we'll back off the criminal case. Rachel looked worried. Can she do that? She can certainly try, John replied. These are nuisance lawsuits, but fighting them takes money and time. Mr. Mitchell, our new vice president, leaned forward. My cousin's a lawyer. He says we might qualify for anti-SLAPP protections. These laws prevent people from using lawsuits to silence public criticism. A spark of hope ignited in the room. Margaret had spent years using fear to control Oak Ridge Estates. But this time, we weren't backing down. The strategy to counter Margaret Whitmore's legal onslaught came from an unexpected source, Lisa Monroe, the investigative reporter who had been following the case since the beginning. She had continued digging and uncovered a pattern stretching across 3 other communities where the Whitmores had previously lived. They've been running this scheme for over a decade, Lisa explained, laying out the evidence. Different names, same tactics, forcing people out with excessive fines, buying up properties cheap, and installing overpriced security systems through their shell companies. Her exposé aired the following week as a 3-part special on the local news. Former victims from other neighborhoods came forward, strengthening the criminal case and severely undermining Margaret's civil lawsuits. The community of Oak Ridge Estates responded in ways I never imagined. A legal defense fund for those being sued, volunteer attorneys stepping in to help, and a social media campaign that caught national attention. Hashtag HOArrogance trended for days. Margaret's lawyers eventually proposed a settlement, dropped the criminal charges, and she would withdraw her lawsuits and leave town permanently. The response was unanimous, absolutely not. The final showdown didn't happen in a courtroom, but at Margaret's city council fraud hearing. As she arrived, dressed in an expensive suit, confidence radiating off her, she was met with an unexpected sight. Rows of Oak Ridge Estates residents lining the sidewalk in silent protest. Elderly couples she had fined for garden gnomes. Young families penalized for fences an inch too high. The Parkers, whose stolen tools had sparked one of her many abuses of power. The Mitchells, whose children had been barred from playing basketball in their own driveway. The district attorney pulled me aside just before the hearing began. We have a strong case, but you know how these things go. Nothing's guaranteed. We understand, I said. But some fights are worth having, win or lose. Inside, Margaret's confidence faltered the moment her former assistant, Megan, took the stand. She testified about shredded documents, backdated approvals, and Margaret's explicit orders to target specific homeowners for maximum fines. It was the final nail in the coffin. Margaret was held over for trial, and Daniel Whitmore, facing mounting charges, flipped, accepting a plea deal in exchange for testimony. 3 months later, justice was served. Margaret received a 5-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. Their security company collapsed. Our HOA's insurance recovered a significant portion of the stolen funds. At first, the victory felt hollow. The damage Margaret had inflicted on the community couldn't be erased overnight. But slowly, healing began. We rewrote the HOA bylaws, ensuring that major policy changes required a supermajority vote. We created a homeowner advocacy committee to mediate disputes before they escalated into fines. More importantly, we shifted the culture from rigid enforcement to genuine community support. 1 year after the ordeal, we held a neighborhood-wide celebration. Children played freely in yards that no longer had to meet Margaret's arbitrary standards. Gardens flourished with colorful flowers once banned for being too distracting. Fences of all shapes and styles stood tall, unpoliced. The air was filled with laughter, the scent of barbecue, and something Oak Ridge Estates had been missing for years, true neighborly connection. As I helped Rachel Carter hang streamers at the community center, she nudged me. Look at that. I followed her gaze to see a moving truck parked in front of Margaret's old house. A young couple was unloading boxes while their children excitedly explored the yard. Should we tell them about our infamous history? Rachel asked with a smirk. Eventually, I said. But first, let's just welcome them. That evening, as neighbors gathered for our potluck, I was asked to say a few words as HOA treasurer. I kept it simple. A year ago, we were fighting for the right to decorate our own yards. Today, We've learned what community truly means. Neighbors looking out for each other, not policing each other. The applause was warm, genuine. I looked around at the people who had become friends through adversity, and I realized something profound. Margaret had, in an ironic way, given us a gift. She had shown us exactly what we didn't want to be. And in resisting her, we had discovered who we truly were. The fences in Oak Ridge Estates might still stand, but the barriers between us had finally come down.